we need to recognize that it is unlikely. As a matter of fact, it is impossible that we are going to be perfect with this thing. I like to say people who choose all or nothing tend to do nothing because it's impossible to do it all. Hello and welcome to the Fasting Method podcast. I am Coach Heather Shuker, and in today's episode, I'm doing a Q&A episode where I'm going to answer common fasting questions that I hear as a coach with the fasting method. Today's topic is specifically focused around why you might not be losing weight yet, even if you're fasting. Many people start fasting and they expect that weight loss to come off fast. They hear other people do it, talking about how great it is and how well it worked for them. And so they expect similar results. And it can be very frustrating and confusing when you feel like you're doing all of the things and it's just not working for you. So as I answer questions in today's episode, hopefully I'm going to be digging into some of the reasons that you might be struggling to see the results you're looking for. So let's go ahead and get started. The first question is, I've been fasting, trying to stay consistent, but I'm not seeing the weight loss yet. Is that normal? It can be. Here's the thing I want you to recognize when it comes to fasting. It is a spectrum. Coach Terry likes to say that it is a dial. And unfortunately, there is not a one-size-fits-all approach. So where you need to be on that dial is very much dependent on your level of metabolic dysfunction, how much weight you have to lose, how long it's been since you've been carrying extra body fat, etc. And so in general, what we have to do is start somewhere and then adjust that dial based on the results we're getting. Oftentimes, when people come to fasting, they think of a 16-8 or 18-6 fasting protocol as being the end-all be-all when it comes to fasting. And that's not always enough for everyone, but it's a really good starting point. So starting with a 16-hour fast is a really good way to start, but you might need to intensify past that in order to get the results you're looking for. Also, depending on your level of insulin resistance, it might take you a while to get your insulin down far enough that your body is able and willing to start releasing body fat for fuel. The second question that I hear a lot is, how strict do I need to be with my way of eating? Like, do I need to keep a super on-point diet or can I vary that a little bit? Again, that very much depends on your starting point and your goals for yourself. The thing about how intensely we fast or how strict we are with our way of eating is both of those are going to dramatically affect the pace at which we lose weight and whether we do that consistently. So if we are a little bit less strict with our diet, then we will probably lose weight less expediently, right? So if we want to make sure that we are losing weight in a bit of a clip, if you will, then staying on track and saying strict is somewhat required. However, it's really important for us to give ourselves some leeway, some grace when it comes to our way of eating, because a common pitfall that I see is all or nothing thinking. People come to the fasting method gung-ho. They want to fast perfectly, they want to eat perfectly, and then when they're out living their life and they happen to eat something that is maybe not in line with weight loss to the best of their ability, they can be really hard on themselves and feel like, oh my gosh, I'm failing, I'm not doing it right, and therefore I must not have what it takes and quit. That's not ideal, right? That's not the way that we want to approach this thing. We need to recognize that it is unlikely. As a matter of fact, it is impossible that we are going to be perfect with this thing. I like to say people who choose all or nothing tend to do nothing because it's impossible to do it all. And so accepting the fact that, yes, our diet is not going to be quote unquote perfect. I'm not sure there is such a thing. So we need to just accept that sometimes things that aren't exactly the best at reducing our insulin and reversing our insulin resistance is still going to go into our mouths. We're still going to have some of those things, but on the whole, if we can keep those to the minimum, keep our fasting consistent, then we should still be able to make good progress. Of course, how quickly you make that progress and whether or not you make that progress is going to be in direct relationship to how strict and how consistent you are with that diet. common question we hear is, if I do longer fasts, will I get quicker results? Generally, people think if some is good, more is better when it comes to fasting. And careful with that, that is not always the case. When I came to the fasting method as a client, I was told that alternate day fasting was the gold standard for weight loss. And so that's what I applied. Specifically, the protocol I followed that allowed me to lose 55 pounds in 6 months was 3x42, meaning I did 42-hour fasts Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays. And I was very consistent for all of those 6 months. That protocol was highly effective for me, and I have seen it highly effective for other clients. Of course, that's not the only protocol that's going to work for people. It is very much a trial and error approach and trying to figure out what protocol best suits you and your lifestyle. But in general, I have not found as a coach that doing longer and longer fasts seems to be what makes things go faster. We like to say that consistency beats intensity. So from my perspective, doing alternate day fasts at the level that you're capable of being consistent week after week and month after month is by far a more effective approach than trying to keep doing longer and longer fasts. In fact, I've had many clients that join us for our 5-day reset that we do on a monthly basis at the fasting method and have found that their regular ADF or alternate day fasting protocol was more effective for them than a long 5-day fast was for their weight loss. So it's really one of those things that you need to work out for yourself, but don't assume that just because you're doing longer fasts that they're going to be more powerful than shorter, more consistent fasting. And then what are the most common things that can slow progress without people realizing? What I've seen is what really slows down progress is what's happening on eating days. Specifically, things like not adhering to time-restricted eating and being very lax about snacking and grazing all day. What I frequently see is that people are very diligent about their fasts. They make sure that they show up for their 3 therapeutic fasts a week, like I did, right? They do those 3x42s or their 3x36s or their 248s, and the fasts are on point. And then the eating day is a little less so. They're snacking and grazing all day instead of sticking to meal times. What they're eating raises insulin a little too much and gets in the way of the progress that the fasts were doing. So I'll see people spin their wheels because they're doing these great fasts, but then on their eating days, they're eating just a little too much refined sugar, grains, highly processed foods, and those foods can absolutely get in the way of weight loss. Another thing that slows progress without people realizing is using things like nuts and dairy a little too heavy-handedly. When people come to low-carb eating, they tend to transition from those highly addictive foods like breads and cakes and candies and things like that, and then move on to highly addictive foods like cashews and cheese. While those foods are fine and certainly can be sprinkled in, they should be treated more like a garnish, but sometimes people treat them as a snack food. And so when we're eating copious amounts of nuts and dairy, high-fat dairy like cheese, that can be a whole lot of extra food that we're eating, a whole lot of calories and energy. And if we're eating a lot on our eating days, it can negate the progress that we're making on our fasting days. A good question is, what would you say to someone who feels like they're doing everything right, but just not getting results? In general, you want to do some self-diagnostic to see if maybe there is something that you're missing. Common things that we recommend as coaches for people to try is to do some dietary tracking and really see whether or not your carbohydrates are maybe a little too high, whether or not the energy or amount of food that you're eating is too high or even too low. Sometimes people undereat, and that can get in the way of their progress. Whether or not you're getting adequate protein in. So there are definitely some things that we can do in our diet where we might feel like, oh my gosh, I'm doing everything beautifully based on everything I know. And maybe you just have a little bit of a knowledge deficit as to what is required in terms of dietary needs whilst fasting. To be honest, in my experience as a coach, the number one reason that I see people really struggling to lose weight while doing therapeutic fasting, while showing up for these overnight fasts, being very consistent with their time restricted eating, etc., is that they really just are taking in too many refined carbohydrates. Most people grossly overestimate how many you can have and still lose weight. Additionally, I think people underestimate the impact of weekend mentality and the impact of the foods that they're eating whilst in restaurants, whilst out with friends. In terms of the dietary requirements for weight loss, the nice thing about fasting is that it is extremely powerful in creating that deficit, in basically giving your body the opportunity to burn body fat for fuel. But ultimately, if we don't do what's required to get insulin down, and part of what's required is not eating an excessive amount of carbohydrates. If we don't do that part, then even with really good fasting, I've seen people just spin their wheels and not get the results that they're looking for. So if that is you, if you feel like I am fasting on point, my time restricted eating, I'm eating healthy whole foods, yeah, you might, but unfortunately, those healthy whole foods might include just too many carbohydrates. And this frustrates people because they feel like things like whole grains and fruits and root vegetables are all healthy, natural foods. And they're right. And I agree with you. It's really unfair that we can eat foods that come from the earth and still have our weight loss impeded because of them. But ultimately, when it comes to insulin and insulin resistance, if we have too many carbohydrates, we just have too much insulin. And if it's too high, the weight stays stuck. And a really good and common question that I hear is, people say this needs to be a lifestyle change, not just a diet. But how do you actually make that work long term? Yes. One of the biggest arguments I hear against a low-carb diet is that it's not sustainable. And I cannot even explain how frustrated that makes me as a coach and as someone who is trying to help people with their lifestyle change, with changing their relationship with food. Because ultimately, the foods that are the most egregious, that give us the most problems when it comes to insulin resistance, are those highly refined grains and sugars, things like cookies and candies and cakes and processed foods. And the idea that we can't sustainably avoid those garbage foods that are frankly somewhat toxic to us, especially if we're insulin resistant and especially if we have problems with our metabolic function and are moving toward or have type 2 diabetes. To say that it is unsustainable to not eat those things at a toxic level anymore is just like saying that there's no hope, right? There's no possibility for you to heal and for you to be able to lose the weight and keep it off. I do think it's required. I do think cutting down those foods, sometimes way more than you think, and certainly way more than you want to, yeah, it's difficult. But there's a difference between difficult and impossible. And if you want to have any chance of being successful, it's required. It's non-negotiable. And logic dictates that, right? If you were to continue to eat the way that you've always eaten that got you in the mess in the first place, of course you're not going to get yourself out of the mess. So of course you're going to have to eat less of those foods than you have. And if you go back to eating them at the same level, you'll get yourself right back to where you started. That all makes sense. And so the idea that it's not sustainable not to, well, that's the only way. So if you believe it's not sustainable, then you believe it's not possible. So I refuse to accept that as truth, not only as someone who has helped others to change their relationship with food and who has seen them lose significant amount of weight and keep it off, but who is someone who has personally done it, who has personally changed my relationship with food so that I no longer indulge in and engage with foods that, make me sick on a consistent basis. And how do you actually do that? How do you actually make those changes long term? Well, just like anything that you're trying to do that's difficult, you show up consistently and you practice. So, the way that we change our diet is first of all, we look at it, right? We do a self diagnostic, we see where the problems are, and then we curate a new diet. We curate a new way of eating so that it is more in line with lowering that insulin and keeping it down. And then we practice eating the new way and letting go of the things that get in the way. And make no mistake, it is very difficult to do that on your own. And that's part of why the fasting method exists, so that we can come together as a community and talk about how we can make those changes sustainably and consistently, how we can start to rid ourselves of the addictive behaviors that we have around some of these problematic, highly processed foods, how we can stop using them for things like stress management and emotional eating and boredom, all of those types of hunger that we're satisfying that isn't just regular old hunger that you might have read about in Dr. Fung's book, The Hunger Code. As a coach, some of the things that I recommend people try when they're trying to reduce those carbs from the diet so they can start to reverse their insulin resistance. First of all is, like I said, you can try dietary tracking. So you see where you are, see what your baseline is. And then there are a few methods you can use to start lowering your carbs. One way is to just use a low-carb macro approach. A low-carb diet starts at about 100 grams, and so you could choose to eat less than 100 grams of carbs and combine that with your fasting and see if you can start making the moves there, and see if the scale starts moving for you. Another thing that you can try is an elimination diet. I personally love to do a 30-day no sugar, no grains challenge. I encourage you to give that a shot. And that's where you just give up sugar and artificial sweeteners as well as all grains for 30 days and just see what that's like. See what that does for you as far as lowering the carbohydrates in the diet and how that affects the scale. And lastly, a very common thing that I recommend as a coach is for people to try a continuous glucose monitor. Now, I know availability internationally can be tricky. Here in the United States, where I live and work, we're able to get those over the counter online. There are a couple companies that will send one to you. They're very easy to use. And once you know what you're looking at, you can start to see how the foods that you're eating affect your blood sugar. And when you see that objective measurement based on what you eat on your body, you can really start to see how different foods are impacting you and adjust your diet accordingly. Here's the thing, folks, and this is my very strong opinion on the matter. When it comes to weight loss, I do not believe there is a better combination out there than using intermittent fasting and low-carb eating. I have looked under every rock. As far as I'm concerned, this is the answer that you've been looking for if you have struggled with your weight for any amount of time. With that in mind, there is a spectrum on which you can pull both of those levers. There is a spectrum of intensity of how much fasting you do and how strict your diet is. And it is some combination of those two things that is required for you to get the weight loss that you're looking for. And so what your job is as the person walking around in this body that you are trying to lose weight from is to figure that out, is to work on your way of eating so that you can see what is sustainable for you and how tight it needs to be for your weight loss, as well as your fasting, right? What protocol works for you? And combining those two together, it's nuance and it takes trial and error and practice. And I highly encourage that you don't try to do it on your own. That is why coaching exists at the Fasting Method. That is why I invite you to join our community and come to those live coaching sessions so that as you're trying to figure this out, you can not only learn from the coaches, but also other members of the community and see what's working for everyone else and get your questions answered live so that you can troubleshoot and you can get some feedback as to what might be tripping you up, what might be causing your plateau, what you might be overlooking as the reason that you're unable to get that diet in such a way that it's helping you to lose weight, that you're unable to get yourself to the place where you can complete therapeutic fasting. So here is my personal invitation to you to come join us in the community and get this thing done once and for all. And in closing, I have a question for you. Dear listener, what has felt most challenging for you when it comes to weight loss while fasting? Please reach out to us on social media. You might be listening to this on YouTube and you can tell us in the comments. We also have a Facebook page and an Instagram account at The Fasting Method. And so we would love to hear from you. Please reach out. Thank you for listening to the Fasting Method podcast and make good choices.